All right, here we are once again. So, for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the early signs of fascism. I know when you hear the word fascism, what immediately comes to mind is Adolf Hitler in the case of Nazi Germany, but interestingly, fascism was really born in Italy some years before. So, please title your notes for today Fascist Italy. So, to begin, I'm going to introduce you to a figure that's going to be really important heading into the Second World War chapter, and that's Mussolini. Mussolini is the one who actually coins the term fascism. The idea really is born out of a desire for strong leadership in the aftermath of World War I. When the Treaty of Versailles was being signed at the Paris Peace Conference, Italy really did not gain that much from it. Much like Japan, they showed up to the peace conference expecting to be recognized more, but they really didn't get out of it what they were looking for. So, where does the term fascism come from? It actually comes from the word fasces, which is from this Roman symbol. So, you can see basically it's all of these pieces of wood tightly bound together with an axe head coming out of the side. The idea is that through all of these things being solidified as one, a country can achieve this very aggressive and stern power, and that's what fascism is really like. So, what exactly are these characteristics? You'll see an absolute power of the state where the government really has complete and total control. Speaking of total control, we've talked about a lot of different government structures this year. We talked about an absolute monarchy where there's a king, and then recently, in the case of Russia, we talked about a totalitarian regime. You'll see that totalitarianism and fascism really go hand in hand. So, additionally, a fascist regime also is ruled by a single dictator. In the case of Italy, that will be Mussolini. In the case of Germany, that will be Hitler. Also, another important part of this is corporatism, which is essentially the idea that the central government controls corporations, oftentimes through intimidation and fear. Also, extreme nationalism. You'll see tons of symbols, rhetoric, propaganda, all things that are going to solidify the control of the public around this nationalistic spirit. You'll see massive military parades with tanks and all sorts of weapons and guns showing the military superiority of the country. Soldiers wearing the same color, walking with symbols that unite all of them. Think of the swastika in Nazi Germany. Also, an idea is going to resurface here that we've talked about before, the superiority of citizens. Very ethnocentric in a lot of different ways, but the idea that your people are actually more sophisticated, more superior than those around you. And of course, things you've seen before, militarism and imperialism, expanding your borders and growing the size of your military. Just like you saw in the chart that I showed you earlier with the totalitarian regime under Joseph Stalin, you'll see a very similar design here. Secret police forces, censorship of the media, the economy being controlled by a single person, nationalistic spirit, right? All of these things are key components of fascism. So, what are the conditions in Italy that lead to this fascist regime? After World War I, Mussolini begins giving these emotional and impassioned speeches to the public. He called for a strong leader to fix all of Italy's problem. At the time, there was a lot of unemployment. Don't forget, this is taking place around the time of the Great Depression. Strikes are becoming common. You're starting to see signs of communism and socialism in Italy, which was very alarming to a lot of people. It seemed as though capitalism was losing its appeal as the situation for many became more desperate. Mussolini takes advantage of this. He fills this vacuum with this fascist idea. He can solve these problems and he can solve them alone. So Mussolini's followers are known as the Black Shirts because you guessed it, they literally wore black shirts. So These black shirts were instructed to remove communists, to remove socialists from government, and Mussolini argued that they would do whatever it took to purge Italy of these people who threatened their capitalistic ideals. So the movement began 2 years after the Russian Revolution. So this is taking place about 1919, right? The very beginning, or very end, I should say, of World War I. Mussolini starts gaining the support of anti-communist businessmen, of middle-class professionals, basically anyone who is terrified of communism. A lot of the people who support him are everyday white Italian men who see Mussolini as like this masculine figure who can rescue Italy from this, spot of being like subservient to the other world powers. So, a really important event, and one that's key to understanding Mussolini's rise to power, is the March on Rome. So, put a star next to this in your notes. By 1922, the Nationalist Fascist Party had formed. Mussolini gave an impassioned speech saying that either the government would be given to him and his supporters, or they would seize it by marching on Rome, where the government of Italy was basically based. And here's an image of Mussolini in his black shirts marching on the Italian government. At the time, the king of Italy was a man named Victor Emmanuel III. So after Mussolini and his followers seized the government, Victor Emmanuel III really had no choice but to appoint Mussolini as the prime minister of Italy. He thought, though, that in this position that he'd be able to control Mussolini, but he was terribly wrong. So 2 years later, in 1924, a new series of elections was taking place for parliament, and stunningly, the fascists won 66% of the vote, mostly through intimidation, fraud, the issuing of propaganda, suppressing the media, and a lot of other tactics that basically convinced people that they were the only way of fixing Italy's woes. Protests were banned, oppositional newspapers were shut down, unions were outlawed, and ultimately Mussolini was declared Il Duce, which is Italian for the leader. Mussolini declared that a new Roman Empire was born. And I know you've heard a lot of times in this class different leaders hearkening back to the original Roman Empire. We talked about this in the form of Charlemagne. We talked about this throughout the Reformation, through the Age of Absolutism, and now you're seeing it in the rise of fascism here. So opponents of Mussolini claim that Italy was really no better than Russia and China in how it became a totalitarian regime, right? A dictator taking total control of the government. Mussolini had full control of the economy, of the police, schools, courts, the military. Everything was under his fist. He compared the men of Italy to soldiers of ancient Rome, and he used a lot of these symbols and this imagery really to solidify his power, his control over the people. So, last thing for today, many people mistakenly compare fascism to communism in thinking that they're kind of the same thing, when in reality, they're really on two totally opposite sides of the spectrum from each other. So, capitalism would probably be somewhere in the middle. So, they both have a dictator that controls everything. However, and this is important, fascism does not aim for a classless society. In fact, fascism has a very, very clear hierarchical society. Think of like the Nazis. Their vision was that there was this line of superiority, an Aryan race, and they were the most supreme, most envious, what everyone strived to be like. So we're going to pause here today. This is really going to lay the foundation for where we're going to head in terms of the rise of Nazism. Hitler's going to take a lot from Mussolini, when interestingly, by the end of our story, Hitler is really the person who becomes the focal point of fascism, and Mussolini will take a back seat.